again, and welcome back to the third week of this Youth Sunday experience where we're talking about resisting the enemy and how the enemy that is common for all of us, Satan, how he is attacking us, and how we can recognize the tactics that he uses and how we can turn to God for strength to resist the enemy. So I'm going to read this verse, these couple of verses that have become kind of the series defining verses that I think are just incredibly important to this time and how we can resist the enemy. So James 4 verses 7 and 8. So humble yourselves before God, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come close to God and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. And this last part is kind of what I talked about last week and what I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this week. It says, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. So last week, I talked about how our loyalties are divided and how we can be distracted by good things, how the enemy uses good things in our lives to distract us from God, to distract our attention, to turn our focus from being focused on God. And I challenge you guys to reach out and contact me with the good things that are in your personal lives that are being used as distractions, that you recognize the enemy is using as a distraction. And I want to give a shout out to Bobby Ellis for being the first one to send me those and to kind of have a brief little conversation about that. That was awesome, and I hope I can have more of those conversations with all of you. But this week we're going to be talking about how the enemy continues to use those distractions, continues to use those good things, and how that can create, if we allow it to, how it can create a deeper issue. So I'm going to be reading a quote from this book, God in the Whirlwind by David F. Wells. But before I get into that quote, he's talking about a specific verse that is very important to our walk and very important to this idea of resisting the enemy. And it's found in Romans 12. It's verse 2. It says, don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you can figure out what God's will is, what is good and pleasing and mature. So this idea of conforming versus transforming, be thinking about that as I read this next quote. Wells says this, we are to be transformed by the renewal of our minds, which is surely what happens when we take hold of the truth God has given us in his word. But also, he says, we are not to be conformed to this world. The shaping of our life is to come from Scripture and not from culture. We are to be those in whom truth is the internal driver, and worldly horizons and habits are not. So Wells is talking about this idea that Paul originally talked about of being conformed and being transformed. So I'm going to share kind of the official dictionary definitions of these two words and then kind of my interpretation of them in light of this context of Romans 12. So conformed, being conformed. The definition is behaving according to socially acceptable conventions or standards. So kind of my interpretation of this definition is we are allowing our outside appearance or the cares that we have that people see, the way that we are perceived, and the way that we want to be perceived, allowing that to change our inside, allowing that to affect our inside. And then transformed, the dictionary definition is making or undergoing a change in form, appearance, or character. And that's kind of the flip side of conformed. And it's rather than letting the outside affect our inside and become what we are on the inside, it's allowing our insides, allowing what God has done in us, that transformative work that he has done in us, to change our outside appearance and change how we interact with people and how we live in this world. So our culture is not the easiest to do that. Our culture, just with advertisements and social media and entertainment, all sorts of things, all of those are not preaching to this idea of transformation. They're preaching this idea of conformation, being conformed. It's a culture of idealism rather than reality. When you post on social media, you have these filters and you have these different angles that you're taking pictures at. You're all these different things. Entertainment and advertisements are the same way. Our world is a world where our outside appearance is so important, and that's what the world wants us to think, that our outside appearance is what is important, and it doesn't care what's on the inside, but God does, and Paul is pointing us to that, to resist the enemy by allowing our insides to become our outside appearance, allowing what God has done in us through Christ, allowing what God has done in us to become our outside appearance. But where does this come from? Wells argues, bouncing off of what Paul says, he argues that we are to be those in whom truth is the internal driver and worldly horizons and habits are not. And the shaping of our life is to come from Scripture and not from culture. Guys, Scripture has valuable stuff. If we allow it, we can be transformed by Scripture. Although, like I said last week, these words are not necessarily written by the authors intended for us today. But God intends them for us today. He knows that they can still be transformative. That His work in these pages affects our life here and now. So Scripture is one of the ways that we can allow for this transformation to come about, and how we can allow our insides to become what the outside world sees. Also, fellow believers, your friends, your family, parents, pastors, that's an option too. That's a way that you can be encouraged to live this transformed life. And so my challenge for this week is, with that, I want you to explain this idea to someone that you're stuck at home with, someone that you're quarantined with. I want you to have a conversation about this idea of being conformed and being transformed, allowing the outside world to affect your inside, or allowing the transformed part of you, the work that God has done in you, to become what the world sees, to become how you act in this world. Have that conversation. Conformed versus transformed, what that means. Maybe explain it to a younger sibling, or explain it to your parents, or reach out to me. I would love to have a conversation with you about what that means, dive a little deeper into what that means and what that means for you. But just have those conversations because they're important. So, love you guys, and I'll talk to you again soon.